Jennifer Walsh kept a garden journal in her handwriting so precise it looked like calligraphy. Each plant's name, each bloom date, each visitor to her backyard sanctuary documented with the care of someone who believed tomorrow would come. In September 1997, the 40-year-old elementary school librarian disappeared after leaving the monthly book club meeting at St. Michael's Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She left behind lesson plans for a unit on fairy tales, tomato plants heavy with fruit that would rot on the vine, and a daughter who would grow up believing that mothers could simply vanish into autumn air. For 26 years, Jennifer's daughter Emma kept every Mother's Day card she'd made but never sent, storing them in a shoebox under her bed like prayers to someone who might still hear them. Then, in August 2023, a genealogical DNA match through a public database gave investigators their first breakthrough in a case that had grown cold as Iowa winters. The evidence pointed to someone who had been part of Jennifer's trusted circle, someone the community had never suspected. The truth would prove that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it sits beside you in church. This is a story about how absence shapes a life as powerfully as presence. It's about Jennifer's belief that children needed imagination as much as they needed facts. And it's about the moment when a daughter's lifetime of questions finally found their terrible, necessary answers. If you value stories like this and want to see more investigations into cold cases that were finally solved, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Please write your country in the comments below. Let's see how far around the world these stories travel. The discovery came on a humid August morning in 2023, the kind of Iowa heat that made everything shimmer. Detective Sarah Reeves had been working cold cases for 3 years, but Jennifer Walsh's file kept finding its way back to her desk. Maybe it was because Sarah had a daughter around the same age Emma had been when her mother disappeared. Maybe it was the photo clipped to the inside of the folder, Jennifer surrounded by third graders at the library, her smile genuine, her hands holding up a copy of Where the Wild Things Are, like it contained actual magic. Or maybe it was the note Sarah had found tucked into the evidence box, written in Jennifer's precise handwriting on a library card. Books are doors. We're teaching children how to open them. Someone had stolen Jennifer's chance to open any more doors. That mattered to Sarah in ways she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself. When the genealogical DNA match came through that August morning, Sarah sat in her car in the precinct parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. She knew what this meant. After 26 years, they finally had a name. The DNA profile from biological evidence collected at Jennifer's crime scene had been run through GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where people uploaded their DNA test results, hoping to find long-lost cousins or trace their ancestry back to Ireland or Africa or wherever their stories began. Instead, this particular search found something else entirely: a familial match. Not to the perpetrator directly, but to someone who shared enough DNA to be a close relative. From there, genetic genealogists had worked backward, building family trees, eliminating branches, narrowing possibilities. The process was painstaking, taking months of work that Sarah had tried not to think about too much, afraid to hope. But now, there was a name. And that name made Sarah's hands shake as she gripped her steering wheel. Thomas Brennan, age 68, retired postal worker, deacon at St. Michael's Church, the same church where Jennifer had gone to book club the night she disappeared, the same church where Jennifer's family still attended, where Emma had been baptized as a baby, where Jennifer's memorial service had been held when the years stretched long enough that people started saying past instead of missing. Thomas Brennan, who had helped organize search parties in 1997, who had brought casseroles to Jennifer's parents in the days after she vanished, who had testified at the initial investigation that he'd seen Jennifer leave the church around 9:15 p.m., headed to the parking lot, and that was the last anyone saw her. Sarah pulled Jennifer's file from her briefcase and opened it on her lap, looking at the witness statements from September 1997. There was Thomas Brennan's testimony, given 3 days after Jennifer disappeared. His handwriting on the statement form was shaky. He'd been upset, Sarah remembered reading in the notes, crying as he described seeing Jennifer walk to her car. Such a lovely woman, he'd said. Always had a kind word for everyone. The detective who'd taken that statement had noted, "Witness very distraught. Genuine concern for victims' welfare." Sarah felt something turn over in her stomach. Genuine concern, or guilty conscience, or something more calculated. The performance of a man who knew exactly what had happened to Jennifer Walsh because he'd made it happen. She thought about Emma, who was 33 now. Emma, who had grown up in the shadow of her mother's disappearance, who had learned to introduce herself at new schools with, "My mom is missing," because it was easier than having people find out later. Emma, who had gotten married 2 years ago and walked down the aisle with her grandfather because her mother wasn't there. Emma, who had given birth to a daughter last spring and named her Jennifer, a name that was both memorial and hope. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Emma's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Emma's voice bright and professional. "Hi, you've reached Emma Peterson. I'm probably chasing after my toddler, so please leave a message and I'll call you back when I've recovered." Sarah waited for the beep. "Emma, this is Detective Reeves. I need you to call me back as soon as you can. We've had a significant development in your mother's case." She paused, then added softly, "It's good news. Well, it's complicated news, but it's answers. Please call me." She hung up and sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, gathering herself. Then she got out of the car and went inside to brief her captain. Jennifer Walsh had been 40 years old when she disappeared, but everyone who knew her said she had the energy of someone half her age. She taught herself to rollerblade when she turned 35, skating through Ellis Park every Sunday morning until her daughter Emma begged to learn too. She dyed her hair auburn because she liked how it looked in autumn light. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, but constantly forgot where she'd put them, often finding them hours later still perched on top of her head. She had been an elementary school librarian for 15 years, working at Coolidge Elementary in Cedar Rapids. The library was her kingdom. She'd inherited it from Mrs. Henderson, who had retired after 40 years of maintaining strict silence and organizing books with military precision. Jennifer had kept the organization, but ditched the silence rule. Her library buzzed with noise, kids reading aloud to each other, groups working on projects, Jennifer herself doing silly voices for picture books during story time. She decorated the library for every season and holiday. In fall, paper leaves cascaded from the ceiling. In winter, she strung white lights around the windows and read nothing but books with snow in them. Spring meant flowers everywhere, real ones she brought from her garden, filling the library with the smell of hyacinth and lily. Summer was when she planned the fall book lists and reorganized sections, always trying to make books more accessible, more inviting, more impossible to resist. "Mrs. Walsh made me love reading," one former student wrote on the memorial page after Jennifer disappeared. "I was in 3rd grade, and I hated school until I went to the library. She helped me find the Magic Treehouse books and told me reading was like having a secret superpower. I still think about that. Another wrote, "She let me sit in the reading corner and cry when my parents got divorced. She didn't ask questions or tell me it would be okay. She just brought me tissues and a copy of Bridge to Terabithia and said, 'This book understands.' She was right. It did." Jennifer's husband, Mark Walsh, had died of a heart attack 3 years before she disappeared. He'd been 42, Jennifer 37, Emma 11. The grief had been catastrophic for Jennifer. Mark had been her high school sweetheart, the only man she'd ever loved, her best friend for over 20 years. She'd taken a leave of absence from the library for 3 months, barely functioning, barely speaking. Her parents moved in to help with Emma, to make sure someone was feeding everyone, making sure lights got turned off, making sure life continued even when it felt impossible. But slowly, Jennifer had come back. Not all the way. Grief doesn't work like that. But enough. She returned to the library. She started smiling again, though her eyes held a new sadness that never quite went away. She joined a grief support group at St. Michael's Church and eventually started a book club there, because books had always been her way of processing the world. She told me once that books saved her life. Her friend Patricia Morrison said in her witness statement, "After Mark died, she said she would read until 3 a.m. because she couldn't stand the silence of the house. She read everything: poetry, thrillers, romance novels, biographies. She said it was like having voices in the darkness, proof that other people had survived terrible things." By the time of her disappearance in September 1997, Jennifer had built a new life. Not the life she'd planned. She and Mark were supposed to grow old together, supposed to watch Emma graduate high school and college, supposed to become grandparents someday. But a life nonetheless. She had her garden. She had her students. She had Emma, who was 14 and brilliant and occasionally infuriating in the way 14-year-olds are. She had her book club friends and her Sunday morning rollerblading and her careful, precise handwriting in her garden journal. She had hope, tentative and fragile, that maybe she could be happy again someday. Not the same happiness. That was gone with Mark. But something, a different kind of light. That hope died on September 19th, 1997, in a church parking lot in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The book club met on the 3rd Friday of every month at St. Michael's Church, in a basement room that smelled like old carpet and instant coffee. There were 8 regular members, all women, ranging in age from 32 to 67. They'd been meeting for 2 years, ever since Jennifer started the group as part of her grief counseling process. The September meeting was dedicated to The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, Jennifer's choice. She'd given a passionate argument for revisiting children's classics, saying that books you loved as a child revealed different truths when you read them as an adult. Mary Lennox is grief-stricken and angry, Jennifer had said at the previous meeting. We're told she's spoiled, but really she's a traumatized child who's lost everything. As an adult, you see that differently. You understand her better. The discussion that night had gone well. Jennifer had been animated, excited, pointing out passages she'd marked with sticky notes. She'd brought cookies she'd baked, chocolate chip, slightly burned on the bottom because she'd been reading and forgotten to set a timer. Everyone teased her about it. She laughed and said, "Burnt cookies are a sign of a life well lived. Means you were busy doing something more important than watching an oven." The meeting ended at 9 p.m., as it always did. Everyone packed up their books, threw away paper cups, folded the metal chairs, and stacked them against the wall. Jennifer was talking with Patricia about next month's book selection. Patricia wanted to read something contemporary, Maybe Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. Jennifer was writing it down in her planner, her handwriting neat and purposeful. I need to get home, Jennifer said, checking her watch. Emma has a math test tomorrow, and I promised I'd quiz her on formulas before bed. That girl's going to be an engineer or something, Patricia said. She's got Mark's brain for numbers. Jennifer smiled, the way she always did when someone mentioned Mark. Sad, but grateful. She does. She's so much like him sometimes it takes my breath away. They walked up the stairs together, out into the church vestibule. Several of the other book club members were still there, chatting with Father Kowalski about the upcoming church bazaar. Thomas Brennan was there too, having just finished locking up the church office where he'd been working on the bulletin for Sunday's service. He was a deacon, a volunteer position that meant he helped Father Kowalski with administrative tasks and assisted during Mass. Good book club meeting? Thomas asked, friendly as always. He was 42 years old in 1997, married with 3 teenage sons, known around the parish as someone you could count on. He'd been a deacon for 5 years, a postal worker for 20. He volunteered with the youth group and helped organize the annual parish picnic. His wife Linda sang in the choir. Wonderful, Jennifer said. We talked about The Secret Garden. Ah, Frances Hodgson Burnett. Classic. My mother used to read that to me when I was a boy. Thomas smiled, that gentle smile that made him look trustworthy. Safe. You headed home? Yes, I need to help Emma study. Drive safely. It's supposed to rain later. I will. Good night, Thomas. Good night, Jennifer. Those were likely the last words anyone at the church heard Jennifer Walsh speak. She walked out the front doors at approximately 9:15 p.m., headed across the parking lot to where she'd parked her car, a blue 1994 Honda Accord, slightly dented on the passenger side from where Emma had accidentally hit it with her bike 2 years earlier. Jennifer had never gotten it fixed. She said the dent gave the car character. Patricia Morrison watched from the church doorway as Jennifer reached her car, saw her fumble with her keys, saw the dome light come on as she opened the driver's door. Then Patricia turned back to continue her conversation with Father Kowalski about the bazaar, and that was the last time anyone who would admit it, anyway, saw Jennifer Walsh alive. Emma Walsh was 14 years old when her mother disappeared, right at that age where you're starting to separate from your parents, starting to find your own identity, starting to think of them as people rather than just as mom and dad. She'd been annoyed with Jennifer that morning because Jennifer had insisted Emma wear a jacket to school, even though it was 70 degrees outside. It's going to cool down this afternoon, Jennifer had said, holding out Emma's denim jacket. Mom, I'm not 5. I can check the weather myself. Humor me. I'm your mother. Worrying is literally my job description. Emma had rolled her eyes but taken the jacket, stuffing it into her backpack. That eye roll would haunt her for decades, such a small moment of teenage attitude. So normal, so forgettable. Except it was the last time she'd see her mother, which meant it could never be forgotten. When Jennifer didn't come home that night, Emma initially wasn't worried. She'd fallen asleep on the couch studying for her math test, textbook open on her chest, calculator on the floor. She woke up at 11:30 p.m. and was surprised her mother hadn't woken her up, hadn't made her go to bed properly. She checked Jennifer's bedroom. Empty, bed still made. She checked the kitchen. No dishes in the sink. No sign that her mother had come home. Emma called her mother's cell phone. It rang and rang, then went to voicemail. Jennifer's voice, cheerful and professional. Hi, you've reached Jennifer Walsh. I'm either shelving books or elbow deep in my garden, so leave a message and I'll call you back when my hands are free. Mom, Emma said to the voicemail. "Where are you? I thought you'd be home by now. Call me." She tried again at midnight. Again at 12:30. By 1 a.m., Emma called her grandparents, Jennifer's parents, Robert and Claire Mitchell, who lived 15 minutes away. Her grandfather answered on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep. "Emma? What's wrong?" "Grandpa, Mom's not home. She went to book club and she was supposed to be back by 10 and I don't know where she is." There was a pause. Emma could hear her grandfather fully wake up, could hear the shift from confused to alert. "She's not home? You're sure?" "I've been calling her phone. She's not answering." Okay, sweetheart. We're coming over. Lock the doors and stay inside. We'll be there in 10 minutes. Emma's grandparents arrived in 8 minutes, her grandmother still in her nightgown with a coat thrown over it, her grandfather in sweatpants and an old Iowa Hawkeyes t-shirt. They tried Jennifer's cell phone themselves, with the same result, straight to voicemail. They called the church. No answer. They called Patricia Morrison, waking her up. "Jennifer left around 9:15, Patricia said, her voice sharp with sudden worry. She was going home to help Emma study. She should have been home by 9:30 at the latest. Robert Mitchell called the police at 2:17 a.m. The dispatcher asked if there was any reason to believe Jennifer might have left voluntarily, any recent arguments, any signs of distress, any history of disappearing. Robert said no, absolutely not. His daughter was devoted to her child, responsible, reliable. Something was wrong. The dispatcher said they'd send an officer to take a report, but gently noted that adults sometimes left for their own reasons and usually came home within 48 hours. Robert Mitchell's hands shook as he hung up the phone. He looked at his granddaughter, 14 years old and scared, sitting on the couch wrapped in one of her mother's cardigans. He tried to believe what the dispatcher had said, that Jennifer would come home, that there was a reasonable explanation. But some part of him, the part that had been a father for 40 years and knew his daughter's heart better than anyone, knew this was different. Jennifer wouldn't disappear, wouldn't leave Emma like this. Not willingly, never willingly. By dawn, when Jennifer still hadn't come home or called, they all knew. Emma sat at the kitchen table while her grandparents made phone calls, and she knew with the terrible certainty of intuition that her mother was gone. Not away or lost, or any of the gentle words adults would use. Gone. Something bad had happened. The world had split open and swallowed her mother whole. Emma looked at the math textbook still lying on the couch, formulas she'd studied until her eyes blurred. She'd gotten a B+ on that test, one of her best grades. Her mother never knew. Jennifer had been so proud of Emma's math skills, had always said Emma got that from her father, from Mark, who could calculate tips in his head and always knew exactly how much paint to buy for a room. Emma would spend the next 26 years wondering if her mother had thought about her in those final moments. She would wonder if Jennifer had fought back, if she'd tried to get home. She would wonder if her mother had known that Emma loved her, even though Emma had been in that difficult teenage phase where you don't say, "I love you," as easily, where you roll your eyes and act annoyed even when you're not. The last thing Emma had said to her mother that morning was, "Whatever, Mom," in response to something Jennifer had said about cleaning her room. For 26 years, Emma would wish with every molecule of her being that she could take back those words, could replace them with, "I love you," could give her mother something better to carry into whatever darkness came for her that September night. The investigation into Jennifer Walsh's disappearance began in earnest on September 20th, 1997, when Cedar Rapids police officially classified her as a missing person. Jennifer's blue Honda Accord was found that afternoon in the parking lot of St. Michael's Church, exactly where she'd parked it the night before. The car told a story that made detectives' blood run cold. The driver's door was closed, but unlocked. Jennifer's purse was on the passenger seat, her wallet inside with cash and credit cards untouched. Her car keys were in the ignition. The book she'd been discussing at book club, her personal copy of The Secret Garden with sticky notes marking her favorite passages, was on the dashboard. Most telling, Jennifer's reading glasses were on the ground beside the driver's door. One lens cracked, the chain that she wore them on snapped. It looked like she'd been grabbed as she was getting into her car, Detective Raymond Torres noted in his report. Possibly forced into another vehicle. The broken glasses suggested a struggle, brief but violent. Jennifer hadn't gone quietly. That would have been consistent with her personality. Her friends and family all said she was strong-willed, protective, a mother bear who would have fought if she thought she could get back to her daughter. The parking lot was gravel, which made finding tire tracks nearly impossible. The church didn't have security cameras in 1997. Few places did back then. There were houses across the street, but none of the residents reported seeing or hearing anything unusual that night. It had started raining around 10 p.m., which meant any potential evidence in the parking lot had been washed away. The investigation followed standard protocol. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd been at the church that night. All the book club members, Father Kowalski, Thomas Brennan, and 2 other volunteers who'd been working in the church kitchen preparing for Sunday's coffee hour. Everyone had the same story. Jennifer had left around 9:15 p.m., seemed normal, headed to her car alone. Thomas Brennan's statement was particularly detailed. He said he'd watched Jennifer walk across the parking lot because he'd been concerned about women walking alone at night. There had been a series of car break-ins in the neighborhood a few weeks earlier. He'd stood in the church doorway until he saw her reach her car safely, saw the dome light come on. Then he'd gone back inside to finish his work. "I wish I'd walked her to her car," he told Detective Torres, his voice breaking. "I keep thinking, if I'd just walked with her, maybe." He couldn't finish the sentence. Torres noted that Thomas was visibly upset, hands shaking, eyes red. The other interviews revealed a picture of Jennifer as someone universally liked, with no known enemies, no recent conflicts, no one who might want to hurt her. Her friends described a woman who was still grieving her husband, but finding her way through it, devoted to her daughter, passionate about her work. There were no concerning ex-boyfriends. Jennifer hadn't dated anyone since Mark's death 3 years earlier. Her finances were ordinary, teacher's salary, modest savings, no significant debts. Nothing to suggest any reason she might be targeted. The case received significant media attention. Missing woman stories always did, especially when the victim was white and middle class and could be described as a devoted mother and a beloved teacher. The local news ran Jennifer's photo for weeks, a picture from the previous spring showing her in her garden, kneeling beside her tomato plants, smiling at the camera with dirt on her hands and joy on her face. It was a good photo. It made people want to help. Tips came in steadily for the first month. Someone thought they'd seen Jennifer at a gas station in Des Moines. Someone else was sure they'd spotted her at a rest stop on I-80. None of the leads panned out. The FBI got involved, given the possibility Jennifer had been taken across state lines. They conducted their own interviews, looked for patterns in similar cases, found nothing conclusive. As weeks became months, the active investigation slowed. Not because police didn't care. Detective Torres worked Jennifer's case obsessively, sacrificing sleep and weekends, following every lead no matter how tenuous. But there was simply nothing to follow. No evidence, no witnesses, no body. Jennifer had vanished as if she'd never existed at all. The case went cold. Not officially. Officially, it remained open, Jennifer still classified as missing. But practically, realistically, it went cold. Torres retired in 2004, handing the file to Detective Sarah Reeves with a gruff, "Find her. She deserves to be found." Sarah had promised she would try. That was 2020, 23 years after Jennifer disappeared. The case file was thick with witness statements, investigative reports, dead-end leads. Sarah read through all of it, took notes, built a timeline. Then she sent Jennifer's evidence to a private lab that specialized in genealogical DNA analysis. It took 3 years for the results to come back. 3 years of hoping, 3 years of Emma checking in every few months, asking if there was any news. 3 years of Sarah learning everything she could about Jennifer Walsh, her favorite books, her garden layouts, her handwriting in that precise, beautiful script. Sarah had never met Jennifer, but she felt like she knew her. That's what happened when you read someone's journals, their planners, their notes to their daughter. You learned their heart. When the DNA match finally came through in August 2023, Sarah sat in her car and cried before calling Emma. Because now they had a name, and that name was going to destroy people, not just Emma, but an entire community that had believed in someone's goodness. Thomas Brennan, deacon, volunteer, neighbor, monster. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning in August 2023, 26 years and 11 months after Jennifer Walsh disappeared. Sarah Reeves had coordinated with the Lynn County Prosecutor's Office, with the FBI, with 2 other detectives. They had the genealogical DNA evidence. They had cell phone records from 1997 that hadn't seemed significant at the time, but now took on new meaning. They had witness statements to revisit with fresh eyes. They had enough for an arrest warrant. Maybe not enough for a guaranteed conviction. That would depend on what else they could find. But enough to bring Thomas Brennan in for questioning. Sarah was the one who knocked on his door at 6:47 a.m. Thomas answered in pajamas and a bathrobe, 68 years old, gray-haired, looking like someone's grandfather. Which he was. He had 8 grandchildren, ranging in age from 3 to 17. His wife, Linda, had died from cancer 2 years earlier. He was retired, living alone in a modest ranch house with a vegetable garden in the backyard. "Detective Reeves," Thomas said, recognizing her from previous cold case inquiries. His face showed confusion, concern. "What's this about? Is something wrong?" "Thomas Brennan, I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1997 disappearance of Jennifer Walsh." Sarah kept her voice professional, steady, though her heart was hammering. "You have the right to remain silent." She watched his face as she read him his rights, watched for panic, for guilt, for recognition. What she saw was shock that looked absolutely genuine. Thomas's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the doorframe to steady himself. "Jennifer?" he whispered. No, there must be some mistake. I tried to help find Jennifer. I searched for her. No, this doesn't make sense. Sir, I need you to turn around and put your hands behind your back. This is insane." But he turned around, complied. His hands were shaking so badly that Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered Jennifer's broken glasses in the church parking lot, remembered Emma waiting 26 years for answers. The pity evaporated. They took Thomas to the police station, put him in an interview room. Sarah let him sit for an hour before she went in, a deliberate choice. Let him think. Let him worry. Let him decide whether he was going to maintain innocence or try for a plea deal. When she finally entered the interview room, Thomas looked small and old, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He'd been crying. His eyes were red, his face blotchy. "I don't understand," he said immediately. She was a friend. I helped look for her. Ask anyone. I was at every search party. I put up flyers. I prayed for her family at church. Why would you think? We have DNA evidence, Thomas. Sarah sat down across from him, put Jennifer's file on the table between them. Biological evidence from the crime scene. We ran it through genealogical databases, built a family tree, narrowed it down. The DNA is yours, so I need you to stop pretending you don't know why you're here. Thomas stared at the file. For a long moment, he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was different, flatter, colder. I want a lawyer. That's your right, but I want you to know something before your lawyer gets here. Sarah opened the file, pulled out the photo of Jennifer in her garden. Jennifer's daughter, Emma, is 33 now. She has a baby, a little girl she named Jennifer, after her mother. Emma grew up without ever knowing what happened. Grew up thinking maybe her mom abandoned her, or maybe her mom died scared and alone. She's lived with that for 26 years. Whatever you did, whatever happened, she deserves to know the truth. Thomas looked at the photo for a long time. Sarah thought she saw something crack in his expression. Regret, maybe, or just the exhaustion of carrying a secret for nearly 3 decades. But then he looked away, his jaw tight. I want my lawyer, he repeated. Sarah left the room. She'd expected this. Most suspects lawyered up immediately, but she'd needed to say what she'd said, needed Thomas to know that Emma existed, that Jennifer had been a real person with a real life, not just a problem he'd solved by making her disappear. The case moved forward. The prosecutor's office charged Thomas Brennan with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering. The evidence tampering charge came from the realization that Thomas, as one of the search volunteers, had likely had access to key areas during the initial investigation. He'd been in a perfect position to mislead, to contaminate evidence, to point investigators in wrong directions. The media coverage was intense. Trusted deacon arrested in 26-year-old cold case, read the headlines. The story had everything the media loved: a respected community member revealed as a predator, a case cracked by genealogical DNA, a family finally getting answers. Thomas's photo ran next to Jennifer's, the contrast jarring. He looked so ordinary, so safe. His 3 sons issued a statement saying they stood by their father, that this was a terrible mistake, that their dad had been a good man their whole lives. They hired an expensive defense attorney from Des Moines, someone who specialized in high-profile criminal cases. Emma Walsh Peterson held a press conference on the steps of the Lynn County Courthouse. She was pale, composed, her hands shaking slightly as she read from a prepared statement. For 26 years, I've wondered what happened to my mother, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. I've wondered if she suffered, if she was scared, if she thought about me. Thomas Brennan attended my mother's memorial service. He hugged me and told me he was praying for my family. He looked me in the eye and lied. I don't know if I'll ever understand how someone could do that, how someone could take a mother from her daughter and then pretend to care. But I'm grateful that we finally have answers. And I hope, I pray, that we'll get justice. The trial was scheduled for spring 2024. In the meantime, investigators continued building their case, looking for Jennifer's body, searching Thomas Brennan's current and former properties. They found nothing. No body, no murder weapon, nothing physical that tied Thomas definitively to the crime beyond the DNA evidence. That DNA evidence was powerful, biological evidence that matched Thomas Brennan with a certainty of 99.7%. But defense attorneys could attack genealogical DNA methods, could argue about chain of custody, could create reasonable doubt. The prosecution needed more. They needed Thomas to confess, or they needed to find Jennifer's body. The prosecution's case against Thomas Brennan rested primarily on the genealogical DNA evidence, which, while powerful, wasn't foolproof in a courtroom. Defense attorneys were already preparing to challenge the science, to argue about privacy violations, to suggest the possibility of contamination or coincidence. The prosecuting attorney, Margaret Chen, knew she needed more. What they found came from an unexpected source: journals. Thomas Brennan had kept journals for 40 years, leather-bound notebooks where he recorded his thoughts, his prayers, his struggles. His sons had found them while cleaning out their childhood home after their mother's death, had boxed them up and stored them in Thomas's attic. During the search of Thomas's property following his arrest, investigators had found those boxes. The journals were fascinating in a horrifying way. They showed a man in constant internal conflict, deeply religious, devoted to his church, genuinely trying to be good, but also struggling with what he called his dark urges, his temptations, his weakness. In an entry from May 1997, 4 months before Jennifer disappeared, Thomas wrote, "Saw Jennifer Walsh at church today. She smiled at me. Such a kind woman. So much pain in her eyes since Mark died. I wanted to comfort her. But then the other thoughts came. The ones I'm supposed to pray away. God forgive me." June 1997. Volunteered to help set up for the church picnic. Jennifer was there with Emma, watching her with her daughter. The way she loves that child, it makes me ache. I have Linda. I have my boys. I should be satisfied. Why am I not satisfied? What's wrong with me? August 1997. Can't stop thinking about her. This is wrong. This is a sin. Father Kowalski says we must resist temptation through prayer and self-discipline. I pray constantly. It doesn't help. The thoughts just get louder. And then, after Jennifer disappeared, the entries took on a different tone. September 23, 1997. The investigation continues. Police interviewed everyone at the church again. I told them the truth, that I saw Jennifer go to her car. That was the last anyone saw her. The detective asked if I noticed anyone following her or anything suspicious. I said no, because I didn't notice. I was there, but I didn't notice. May God forgive my blindness. October 1997. Emma Walsh came to church with her grandparents today. She looked so small, so lost. I wanted to tell her, but what could I say? That I'm sorry? That I should have protected her mother? That I failed Jennifer in the worst possible way? I lit a candle for her soul. It felt inadequate. December 1997. Linda asked me why I've been so quiet lately, so withdrawn. I told her I'm struggling with Jennifer's disappearance, that it's affected me deeply. She said that's natural, that Jennifer was our friend, that of course I'm grieving. She doesn't understand. No one understands. I carry this weight alone. It's crushing me. The journals continued for 26 years. They never explicitly confessed to killing Jennifer. Thomas was too careful for that, or maybe too deluded, unable to fully admit what he'd done even to himself. But they revealed a pattern of obsession with Jennifer, followed by years of guilt, self-loathing, and what looked like genuine remorse. January 2015. Saw Emma at the grocery store today. She's a woman now, married, wearing a ring. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? I'm just some old man from her mother's church. But I recognized her immediately. She has Jennifer's smile. It broke my heart. April 2023. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about those genealogy DNA databases. They're using them to solve old crimes now. It's all over the news. What if? But no, it's been too long. 26 years. They'll never. God, what have I done? What have I done? The journals didn't explicitly confess to murder, but they showed consciousness of guilt, showed that Thomas knew something about Jennifer's death that he'd never told anyone. Combined with the DNA evidence, they created a compelling narrative. Thomas Brennan had been obsessed with Jennifer Walsh, had taken her that night in the church parking lot, had killed her, whether intentionally or accidentally, and had spent the next 26 years living with the guilt while pretending to be a good Christian man. Margaret Chen, the prosecutor, felt they had enough for conviction. But she also knew that juries could be unpredictable. They needed one more piece. They needed Jennifer's body. The search for Jennifer Walsh's remains began in earnest in November 2023. Investigators started with properties Thomas Brennan had access to in 1997, his former home, his brother's farm 30 miles outside Cedar Rapids, a cabin his family owned near the Mississippi River. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, forensic archaeologists. They found nothing. Sarah Reeves studied the case files obsessively. If Thomas had killed Jennifer that night in September 1997, where would he have taken her? He'd been interviewed by police the next morning, had seemed upset but not panicked. That suggested he'd had time to dispose of evidence, to clean himself up, to compose himself. But where? Sarah drove around Cedar Rapids late at night, trying to think like Thomas would have thought. He was a postal worker. He knew the roads, knew the rural areas, knew where you could go without being seen. He was religious. That was important to his identity. Would that have factored into where he took Jennifer? On a cold December evening, Sarah found herself at St. Michael's Church, standing in the parking lot where Jennifer had been taken. The church had been rebuilt in 2010. New addition, expanded parking lot, modern playground for the parish school. But the old cemetery behind the church remained unchanged. Headstones dating back to the 1880s, oak trees older than the church itself. Sarah walked through the cemetery in the twilight, reading names on headstones. Then she stopped. There was a section of the cemetery that had never been developed, a wooded area at the back marked with a simple chain-link fence. Beyond the fence, the ground sloped down toward a creek. It was Iowa Department of Natural Resources land, protected wetland that couldn't be developed or disturbed. Sarah stood at the fence, looking into the woods. If you wanted to hide something, someone, near the church, but not on church property, this would be perfect. Close enough that Thomas could have taken Jennifer here quickly, hidden enough that no one would think to look. The next morning, Sarah got permission to search the wooded area. It took 3 days with ground-penetrating radar before they found something, a disturbance in the soil about 70 yards into the woods, near the creek bank. The forensic archaeology team worked carefully, methodically. Emma wanted to be there, but Sarah gently suggested she wait at home. "If this is your mother," Sarah said quietly, "you don't want this to be how you remember her. Let me call you when we know for sure." They found Jennifer Walsh's remains on December 14, 2023, 26 years and 3 months after she disappeared. She was buried in a shallow grave, wrapped in a tarp that had deteriorated over the decades. Her dental records confirmed her identity. The crack in her skull suggested blunt force trauma. She'd been hit hard enough to cause death, probably not instantly, but relatively quickly. Sarah called Emma herself. "We found her," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother. We found her, and we're bringing her home." Emma was silent for a long moment. Then, did she suffer? Sarah thought about lying, about offering comfort. But Emma deserved truth. The medical examiner believes death came relatively quickly. She fought back. That's clear from the evidence. She didn't go quietly. But it was fast. I'm so sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry this happened to her. Thank you, Emma whispered. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for not giving up. The trial of Thomas Brennan began on March 15, 2024, in Lynn County District Court. It lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence, explained genealogical genealogy to a sometimes confused jury, brought in experts to testify about the science. They presented Thomas's journals, read selected entries aloud in the courtroom. They presented forensic evidence from Jennifer's remains, the skull fracture, the manner of burial, the proximity to St. Michael's Church. They called Emma Walsh Peterson to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her head high, though her hands shook as she was sworn in. Margaret Chen, the prosecutor, asked her to describe her mother. She was the best person I knew, Emma said, her voice steady. She loved teaching, loved books, loved making things grow. After my father died, she was devastated, but she rebuilt her life. She found joy again. She was teaching me to do the same, how to survive loss and find meaning anyway. Emma looked directly at Thomas Brennan, sitting at the defense table. She was kind to everyone, including you, and you used that kindness to destroy her. The defense argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that genealogical genealogy was unproven science, that Thomas's journals showed guilt over not protecting Jennifer, but not guilt over killing her. They presented character witnesses, Thomas's sons, members of St. Michael's Parish, co-workers from the post office who said Thomas had always been a good man. But the defense couldn't explain away the DNA, couldn't explain why biological evidence from a violent crime matched Thomas Brennan with near certainty, couldn't explain the obsessive journal entries about Jennifer, couldn't explain why Jennifer had been buried in woods directly behind the church where Thomas volunteered. Thomas himself never took the stand. His attorney advised against it, knowing that prosecutors would tear him apart on cross-examination. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Thomas Brennan guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, evidence tampering. When the verdict was read, Thomas Brennan closed his eyes. His sons, sitting in the gallery, wept. Emma sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, tears streaming down her face. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge gave Thomas Brennan life in prison without possibility of parole. Before the sentence was formally entered, the judge allowed Emma to read a victim impact statement. Emma stood at the podium, a piece of paper in her hands. But she didn't read from it. Instead, she looked at Thomas directly. "You killed my mother," she said. "But you didn't just kill her that night in 1997. You killed her every day for 26 years by letting my family believe she might still be alive, by pretending to care, by watching us grieve and doing nothing. You took my mother's life, and then you took her memory. You made her death a mystery, a ghost story, something people whispered about. You denied her dignity even in death." Her voice broke, but she continued. "I'll never forgive you. I can't. But I want you to know that despite everything you did, my mother's love survived. It survived in me, in her students who still remember her, in the garden journals she kept that taught me how to make things grow. You tried to erase her, but you failed. She's still here. She'll always be here." Thomas Brennan never looked up during Emma's statement. When Emma finished and walked back to her seat, he said something too quietly for anyone to hear. Later, his attorney would say Thomas had whispered, "I'm sorry," but no one could confirm it. Thomas Brennan was 69 years old at sentencing. He would die in prison, which felt like justice, though Emma would later say that no punishment could truly balance the scales of what he'd taken. Jennifer Walsh was buried in Cedar Rapids Municipal Cemetery on a bright May morning in 2024. It was 26 years and 8 months after she disappeared, but her family finally had her back. Hundreds of people attended the funeral. Former students, now adults with children of their own, came to say goodbye to Mrs. Walsh, who had made them love reading. Book club members who'd never stopped meeting, who'd kept Jennifer's chair empty at their monthly gatherings for over 2 decades, came to finally say goodbye. Teachers from Coolidge Elementary, many retired now, came to honor a colleague who'd made the library a magical place. Emma gave the eulogy. She talked about her mother's garden, how Jennifer had tried to teach Emma the names of every plant, how Emma had been a terrible student who couldn't tell mint from basil. She talked about Jennifer's terrible singing voice, how she'd sing along to Bonnie Raitt in the car, and Emma would beg her to stop. She talked about the way Jennifer had survived Mark's death, had found a way forward even when forward seemed impossible. "My mother believed in second chances," Emma said. "She believed people could survive terrible things and still find joy. She proved it with her own life. And I want to honor that today, not just by remembering how she died, but by remembering how she lived. With love, with hope, with her hands in the dirt, and a book always nearby, and a daughter she loved more than anything." Emma was holding her 1-year-old daughter, Jennifer, called Jenny by everyone who loved her. "Baby Jenny had her grandmother's eyes," Emma said. She was going to grow up hearing stories about the grandmother she'd never meet, about the woman she was named for. After the service, people gathered at Ellis Park, the park where Jennifer used to rollerblade, the park where she'd taught Emma to skate. They planted a dogwood tree in Jennifer's memory, with a small plaque. Jennifer Walsh, 1957-1997. She taught children to love books and taught her daughter to love life. Emma watered the tree with Jenny on her hip, thinking about circles, how life moves in circles, how her mother had taught her to find beauty in small things, how now Emma was teaching her own daughter the same lessons. The circle was broken in 1997, but it was rebuilding itself. Differently, painfully, but rebuilding. Sarah Reeves retired from the Cedar Rapids Police Department 6 months after Thomas Brennan's conviction. She was 53 years old, young for retirement, but the case had taken something out of her. 27 years in law enforcement, the last 7 focused almost exclusively on cold cases. She'd solved 9 of them, brought closure to 9 families who'd been waiting years or decades for answers. But Jennifer's case was different. Maybe because Sarah had never met Jennifer, but had grown to love her anyway, through her handwriting, her garden journals, her careful notes about her students. Maybe because Emma reminded Sarah of her own daughter. Maybe because the case showed how evil could wear such a normal face, could sit in church and pray while carrying the weight of murder. On her last day at the precinct, Emma came to say goodbye. They'd become something like friends over the past year, bonded by the strange intimacy of shared trauma. Emma brought flowers, peonies, Jennifer's favorites. "I wanted to thank you," Emma said, "for caring when you didn't have to, for treating my mother like she mattered." "She did matter," Sarah said. "She still does." They stood together in the precinct lobby, both of them crying a little, both of them laughing at their tears. Then Emma hugged Sarah, hard, and whispered, "You gave my mother back to me. I can never repay that." After Emma left, Sarah sat at her desk, soon to be someone else's desk, and thought about justice. It was imperfect, insufficient, unable to restore what was lost. Jennifer was still dead. Emma had still grown up without her mother. 26 years were still gone. But there was something in knowing, something in truth, even terrible truth. Emma could visit her mother's grave now, could tell her daughter stories about a grandmother with dirt on her hands and books in her heart. The mystery that had haunted the Walsh family for decades was solved. That wasn't nothing. It was imperfect justice, but it was justice nonetheless. Sarah cleared out her desk, packed up the files she was allowed to keep as mementos. At the bottom of her drawer, she found the photo of Jennifer in her garden that had been clipped to the case file all those years. Jennifer smiling, her hands in the soil, creating life. Sarah took the photo with her when she left. She'd frame it, keep it on her bookshelf at home, a reminder of why the work mattered. Jennifer Walsh would never know that a detective she'd never met had spent years trying to bring her home. But Sarah knew. And somehow, that was enough. 5 years after Thomas Brennan's conviction, Emma Walsh Peterson published a book. It was called The Garden After, a daughter's memoir of loss and rediscovery. It was part memoir, part true crime, part meditation on grief and justice, and what it means to carry loss forward. The book was dedicated to my mother, who taught me that even broken things can grow, and to my daughter, who will know her grandmother through stories. In the book, Emma wrote about growing up in the shadow of her mother's disappearance, about the way grief shaped her identity, about the complicated relief of finally having answers. She wrote about forgiveness, not of Thomas Brennan, which she said she couldn't manage and didn't feel obligated to attempt, but of herself for the normal teenage irritations she'd felt toward her mother in those final months. She wrote about the garden she'd planted at her own house, using her mother's journals as guides. She'd planted all of Jennifer's favorites: tomatoes, marigolds, black-eyed Susans, the herbs Jennifer had grown for cooking. Emma wasn't as skilled a gardener as her mother had been, but she was learning. Her daughter Jenny helped, tiny hands in the dirt, just like Emma's had been 30 years earlier with Jennifer. One chapter of the book was called The Library. In it, Emma described returning to Coolidge Elementary as an adult, walking into the library that had been her mother's kingdom. The library had been renovated since 1997. Computers where the card catalogs used to be, new carpeting, different shelving. But some things remained. The reading corner with oversized pillows where Jennifer used to do story time, the window seat where she'd let sad kids sit when they needed quiet. The current librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had started working at Coolidge in 2003. She'd heard stories about Mrs. Walsh, about the legendary librarian who'd made reading an adventure. When Emma introduced herself, Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "Your mother is a legend here," Mrs. Patterson said. "We tell new teachers about her, how she transformed this library, how she knew every kid's reading level and interests, how she made them believe books were magic. There's still a plaque dedicated to her by the front desk." Emma hadn't known about the plaque. It was small, brass, installed by the school board in 2000. In memory of Jennifer Walsh, 1957-1997. She opened doors for children and taught them to walk through. Emma stood in her mother's library and cried, grateful and heartbroken in equal measure. This was part of Jennifer's legacy too. Not just the way she died, but the way she'd lived, the children she'd inspired, the love she'd given freely, the books she'd pressed into small hands saying, "This one, you'll love this one." At the end of the book, Emma wrote about hope. Not the naive hope that bad things won't happen. Life had taught her better than that. But the resilient hope that meaning can be found even in terrible circumstances. that love persists even after death, that stories matter because they keep people alive in the hearts of those who remember them. My mother believed in the power of stories, Emma wrote. She believed that stories connect us, teach us, save us. So I'm telling hers, all of it, the beautiful parts and the terrible parts and the long, quiet years of waiting in between, because she deserves to be more than a cold case that was solved. She deserves to be remembered as a woman who loved fiercely, gardened passionately, and taught children that books could take them anywhere. She deserves to be remembered as my mother. The book became a bestseller, which surprised Emma. She'd written it for herself, for her daughter, for the students her mother had taught. She hadn't expected thousands of strangers to read it, to write to her saying they'd cried, saying they were inspired, saying they'd planted gardens in their mother's memory, or donated books to libraries, or called their own mothers to say, "I love you." But that's what happened. Jennifer Walsh's story touched something universal: the fear of losing someone you love, the ache of unanswered questions, the complicated relief when answers finally come. People who'd never heard of Cedar Rapids or St. Michael's Church or Jennifer Walsh connected with the story because it was about something bigger than one woman's murder. It was about grief and survival and the way families carry on even when their hearts are broken. Emma went on a book tour, speaking at libraries and bookstores across the country. She always brought her daughter, now 6 years old, who would color in the back of the room while Emma talked about her grandmother. Sometimes Emma would bring Jenny up on stage, would tell the audience, "This is Jennifer Walsh's granddaughter. She has her grandmother's smile and her grandmother's love of stories, and she's proof that loss doesn't get the final word. Love does." People would ask Emma if she ever confronted Thomas Brennan, if she'd visited him in prison, if she'd sought any kind of closure beyond the trial. Emma always said no. She'd said everything she needed to say in her victim impact statement. Thomas Brennan didn't deserve any more of her time, her energy, her thoughts. "I spent 26 years wondering about my mother," Emma would say. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life thinking about the man who killed her. He's in prison. He'll die there. That's enough." Instead, Emma focused on keeping her mother's memory alive in positive ways. She started a scholarship fund for students studying library science, awarded annually to someone who demonstrated Jennifer's passion for connecting children with books. She worked with Coolidge Elementary to expand the library, adding a new section called Jennifer's Corner, dedicated to books about grief, loss, and resilience, the kinds of books that had helped Emma survive her mother's disappearance. She planted gardens everywhere, at her home, at Jenny's school, in the community park near where she lived. She taught Jenny the names of plants in that same patient way Jennifer had tried to teach her. This time, Emma paid attention. This time, she understood that gardening wasn't just about making things grow. It was about tending to life, about hope, about believing in seasons and cycles and renewal. 10 years after Jennifer Walsh's body was found, Emma returned to Cedar Rapids for the dedication of a memorial. The city had renovated Ellis Park, and as part of the renovation, they'd created a memorial garden dedicated to missing and murdered people from the area. Jennifer's name was on a stone plaque, along with 12 others, people who'd disappeared or been killed, people whose families had waited for answers, people whose stories mattered. The dedication ceremony was on a September afternoon, 26 years and a few days after Jennifer disappeared. Emma spoke at the ceremony, her daughter Jenny standing beside her, almost 12 now, tall and thoughtful, so much like the grandmother she'd never met. "My mother loved gardens," Emma said to the crowd gathered in the park. She believed gardens were places of possibility, where tiny seeds became something beautiful, where broken earth could heal and bloom again. This memorial garden feels like something she would love. It's a place of remembrance, but also a place of hope. It says, these people mattered. Their lives had meaning. Their loss left wounds, but from those wounds, something can still grow. After the ceremony, Emma and Jenny walked to the dogwood tree they'd planted 10 years earlier in Jennifer's memory. It had grown tall now, branches spreading wide, white flowers blooming even in late September. Emma touched the tree's trunk, thinking about circles again, how her mother had planted things, and now Emma planted things, and Jenny was learning to plant things. How love passed down through generations, rooting itself deeper with time. Jenny said, "Tell me about Grandma Jennifer again. Tell me about the library." So Emma did. She sat on the grass beneath the dogwood tree and told her daughter stories about the grandmother she was named for, about a woman who had believed books were magic and gardens were miracles and children were worth every ounce of love you could give them, about a woman who had survived devastating loss and found her way back to joy, about a woman whose life had been cut short, but whose love had never ended. "She would have adored you," Emma told her daughter. "She would have read you every book in the world. She would have taught you the names of every flower. She would have loved you so much." "I know," Jenny said. "I feel it sometimes. Like she's still here, kind of." Emma pulled her daughter close. "She is. She's in the stories we tell. She's in the garden we planted. She's in your name and your smile and the way you love books just like she did. Love doesn't die, sweetie. It just changes shape." They sat together under the tree until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The park was quiet, peaceful, full of the kind of beauty Jennifer had always noticed and treasured. Somewhere in the distance, Emma could hear children playing, their laughter carrying on the wind. And Emma thought, this is how we survive. This is how we honor the people we lose, not by forgetting them or being destroyed by their absence, but by carrying them forward, by planting trees in their memory, by telling their stories, by loving our own children with the same fierce devotion they loved us, by refusing to let loss have the final word. 26 years after Jennifer Walsh disappeared, 36 years after she planted her first garden, her daughter sat under a tree planted in her memory and told stories to a granddaughter Jennifer never got to meet. The circle was broken, but not destroyed. The story was tragic, but not finished. Because love persists, stories endure, and gardens, even gardens planted in grief, eventually bloom. Jennifer Walsh was 40 years old when she died. She'd been a wife, a widow, a mother, a daughter, a teacher, a librarian, a gardener, a friend. She'd survived the death of her husband and rebuilt her life. She'd touched hundreds of children's lives, making them believe that books could take them anywhere, that stories mattered, that they mattered. She'd been stolen from a church parking lot on a September night in 1997 by someone she trusted, someone who should have protected her, someone who wore the mask of goodness while carrying evil in his heart. She'd been buried in woods behind a church where she'd worshipped, where she'd found community and hope after loss. She'd been missing for 26 years, 3 months, and 25 days before detectives finally brought her home. Her daughter Emma had grown up in the shadow of that loss, had learned to live with absence like a second heartbeat, had built a life despite the hole in her heart where her mother should have been. Emma had survived, more than survived. She'd thrived. She'd become a teacher herself, carrying on her mother's legacy of believing in children. She'd married, had a daughter, written a book. She'd planted gardens and told stories and refused to let grief define her. Jennifer's granddaughter Jenny was growing up knowing her grandmother through stories, through photographs, through the garden journal entries Emma read to her. Jenny knew her grandmother had loved books and plants and believed in magic. She knew her grandmother had died too young, but had lived fully in the time she had. She knew her name carried meaning, that she was named for someone worth remembering. And Detective Sarah Reeves, who'd never met Jennifer but had spent years trying to bring her home, kept that photo of Jennifer in her garden on her bookshelf, a reminder that the work mattered, that finding truth mattered, that giving families answers, even terrible answers, was a kind of mercy. Jennifer Walsh's story was a tragedy. There was no way around that. A good woman was murdered. A daughter lost her mother. Years were stolen that could never be returned. But it was also a story about resilience, about a family that refused to stop hoping, about investigators who didn't give up, about a community that remembered, about love that persisted across decades and death itself. Jennifer had believed books were doors. Her daughter believed the same thing. And this story, Jennifer's story, was another door, another way of keeping someone alive in the hearts and minds of people who never met her but would remember her name. That mattered. That meant something. Jennifer Walsh lived. She loved. She laughed and gardened and taught children to believe in stories. She survived grief and found joy. She was a whole person, a complex person, a person who deserved more time than she got. And now, because of genealogical DNA and determined detectives and a daughter who refused to forget, her story had an ending. Not a happy ending. Those don't exist when someone is murdered. But an ending with truth and justice, and eventually, a kind of peace. The garden Emma planted in her mother's memory blooms every spring. The scholarship fund helps young librarians learn to love books the way Jennifer did. The memorial in Ellis Park reminds the community that the missing matter, that the murdered are not forgotten. And on quiet evenings, Emma sits on her porch with her daughter and tells stories about Grandma Jennifer, the woman who believed in doors and magic and love that refuses to surrender to grief. Jennifer Walsh's life mattered. Her death was a tragedy, but her legacy lives on in gardens and grandchildren and stories told by people who never met her, but carry her memory forward anyway. That's not the ending Jennifer deserved, but it's the ending her story finally found. And in the imperfect arithmetic of grief and justice, sometimes that has to be enough.